November 15, 1875. Montana Territory. The temperature at noon hovered at 22 degrees and was falling fast. The wind coming off the northern peaks didn't just blow, it stripped the heat from anything living, searching for weakness in wool and leather. Amos stood at the edge of the property line, his boot sinking 2 inches into the hard-crusted mud. He did not look back at the farmhouse. There was no point in looking at a door that had been bolted from the inside. The wagon tracks leading away from the porch were fresh, but the decision had been rotting for months. His son, Thomas, had finally said the words that morning, standing by the wood stove with his arms crossed, eyes fixed on the floorboards. "We can't carry you through another hard one, Pa. The flour won't stretch. You got your kit. You got your legs. Best you find your own way before the drifts get too deep." It wasn't cruelty, Amos told himself as he adjusted the heavy canvas pack on his shoulders, it was arithmetic. On the frontier, calorie counts were the only law that mattered. If you couldn't chop, plow, or hunt enough to replace what you ate, you were a deficit. Amos was 64 years old. In the cities back east, that was an age for armchairs and pipe tobacco. Here, it was a liability. He shifted the weight of his Sharps rifle, checking the action one more time out of habit. He had a hatchet, a skinning knife, a cast-iron skillet, a bag of salt, 3 pounds of dried beans, and a wool blanket that had seen better decades. He didn't have a horse. Thomas had kept the mare. That was fair, Amos reasoned. The mare could pull a plow, Amos could not. He turned his back to the wind and began walking toward the limestone ridges 3 miles to the west. The territory was vast, gray, and indifferent to his situation. He needed shelter before the sun dipped below the tree line, or the night freeze would kill him just as surely as a bullet. He didn't feel anger. He felt a cold, sharp clarity. The social contract of the family had dissolved, leaving only the physical contract with the earth. Survive or don't. The wind howled, kicking up dust that stung his face, a reminder that the land was not his friend. It was his opponent. He reached the base of the limestone cliffs just as the light began to fail. The geology here was fractured, old seabeds thrust up and broken by time. Amos wasn't looking for a cave in the romantic sense. Deep caverns were damp, dark, and often occupied by bears or cougars. He was looking for an overhang with a specific geometry. He needed a south-facing aspect to catch the low winter sun, and he needed the rock to cup around him, blocking the northern and western gales. He found a fissure about 20 feet up a scree slope. It wasn't a home, it was a scar in the mountainside, perhaps 10 feet deep and 6 feet high, tapering back into darkness. The floor was littered with rat droppings and dry leaves, but the roof was solid, a single slab of gray stone. He climbed the loose shale, his knees popping with every step, his breath pluming in the frigid air. Inside, the wind died instantly. The silence was heavy. Amos dropped his pack and sat on a flat rock, his chest heaving. He took a sip of water from his canteen. It was already starting to slush with ice. He looked out at the valley, watching the lights of his son's farmhouse flicker on in the distance. He didn't envy the warmth. He calculated the distance. He calculated the temperature. He calculated the work. The first night was a test of endurance, not comfort. He couldn't risk a large fire, the heat would shatter the cold rock or smoke him out of the shallow depression. He gathered an armful of sagebrush and dead scrub oak, arranging it near the mouth of the overhang. He struck a match, shielding the flame with cracked, leathery hands until the tinder caught. The fire was small, barely a flicker against the encroaching night, but it broke the psychological grip of the freeze. Amos didn't sleep. He sat wrapped in his blanket, his back against the stone wall, analyzing the space. The cave mouth was too wide. It let in too much air. The ceiling was too high in places, trapping pockets of cold. To survive the blizzards that everyone knew were coming, the ones that buried cattle standing up, he couldn't just inhabit this space. He had to engineer it. He needed a wall. He needed a thermal mass that would absorb the fire's heat and radiate it back when the fuel ran low. He watched the smoke drift along the ceiling, tracing the invisible currents of air. The smoke hugged the roof and curled out the top of the opening. That was good. It meant there was a natural draw. If he built the wall correctly, he wouldn't suffocate. Morning brought light but no warmth. The sky was a sheet of hammered steel. Amos ate a handful of cold beans and started work immediately. The scree slope was full of loose limestone, but he needed specific stones, flat, stackable, and heavy enough to hold against the wind. He spent the first 3 hours just sorting rocks, piling them by size. His hands, stiff with arthritis, fumbled the first few, dropping them on his boots. He stopped, rubbed them briskly, and forced himself to focus. Panic was a waste of energy. He needed mortar. The creek at the bottom of the slope had clay banks. He made for trips, carrying wet, freezing mud in his canvas sack. It was heavy, brutal work. His lower back screamed, a dull, grinding pain that never really left him. He mixed the clay with dry grass he pulled from the frozen earth, creating a binder that would resist cracking when it dried. He began to lay the first course of the wall across the mouth of the cave, leaving a gap 2 feet wide for a door he didn't yet have. "You're building a tomb, old man," the voice startled him. Amos turned, his hand instinctively going to the hatchet on his belt. A rider had come up the valley floor, a scout from one of the cattle drives moving south, pausing his horse at the base of the slope. The man wore a buffalo coat and looked up with a mix of pity and amusement. "It's a shelter," Amos said, his voice rusty from disuse. He didn't stop stacking stones. "Forecast says snow by Thursday." "Real snow?" "That pile of rocks won't hold heat," the rider called out, leaning on his saddle horn. "You got kin nearby?" "Best you head there." "I'm where I need to be," Amos replied. He slapped a handful of mud onto a jagged rock and fitted it into place. The wet clay sucked the heat right out of his skin. The rider shook his head, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the snow. "Suit yourself. Ground's too frozen to dig a grave, so try not to die until spring." He spurred his horse and moved on, the animal's hooves clattering on the frozen ground. Amos watched him go, then looked back at his wall. It was only knee-high. The rider was right about one thing: the snow was coming. Amos picked up another stone. It weighed 20 pounds. He lifted it, grunted, and set it true. By the third day, the wall had reached shoulder height. The physical toll was immense. Amos's hands were raw, the skin cracked and bleeding where the limestone edges had caught him. He had no gloves, so he wrapped rags around his palms, tying them off with strips of rawhide. The construction wasn't pretty. It was a rough, ugly barricade of grey rock and brown mud, but it was thick, nearly 18 inches. Amos understood the principle of thermal lag. Thin walls let the cold in, thick walls held the day's heat and released it slowly at night. He was building a battery made of stone. The challenge was the upper section. He had to taper the wall inward to meet the overhang, sealing the gap. He scavenged sturdy branches from a deadfall of lodgepole pine half a mile away, dragging them up the slope one by one. He used them as a lintel for the doorframe, lashing them together with scavenged wire he'd kept in his pocket for years. The most critical engineering problem was the fireplace. If he just built a fire on the floor, the smoke would fill the enclosed space now that the wall was going up. He needed a chimney. He couldn't build a brick flue, he didn't have bricks. Instead, he used the natural geometry of the cliff. He located a vertical crack in the rock face near the back of the cave. By building the fireplace directly under it and using flat slate stones to create a hood, he could funnel the smoke up toward the fissure. He spent an entire afternoon adjusting the angle of the slate, lighting small twists of dry grass to test the draft. Smoke curled, hesitated, and then, caught by the suction of the rising air, shot up into the rock crack. It worked. The draft was strong enough to pull the smoke, but not so strong it sucked out all the heat. He plastered the inside of the stone chimney with a thick layer of clay to smooth the airflow. It was crude, but it was functional physics. On the evening of the fourth day, the temperature plummeted to single digits. The wall was finished, save for the door itself. Amos had woven a mat of willow branches and stuffed it with dry hay, wedging it into the frame. It wasn't airtight, but it stopped the wind. Inside, he built his first real fire in the new hearth. He used heavier logs now, seasoned oak he had dragged up from the creek bed. The fire caught, and the draft roared softly, a low hum of suction that told him the system was live. He sat on his blanket, watching the flames lick the slate hood. For the first time in 4 days, the air inside the cave wasn't moving. It was still. And slowly, agonizingly slowly, it began to warm. The thermometer in his head told him it was 10 degrees outside. Inside, near the fire, it was maybe 40. To a man who had been living in the wind, 40 degrees felt like a palace. He took off his boots and massaged his toes, checking for the white waxy look of frostbite. They were red and angry, but alive. Hunger was the next enemy. He had burned more calories lifting stone than he had consumed in beans. His supplies were critically low. The 3 pounds of beans were down to 1. The salt was plentiful, but salt didn't keep a heart pumping. On the 5th morning, Amos took his rifle and stepped out of his fortress. The sky was a bruised purple, heavy and low. The air smelled of metallic static, snow. He needed meat, and he needed it before the storm broke. He moved down toward the creek, moving slowly, stepping between the frozen crunch of dry leaves. He wasn't hunting for sport, he was hunting for fuel. He spotted a mule deer track, fresh enough that the edges hadn't crumbled. He followed it for an hour, his breath held tight in his chest. When he finally saw the doe, she was stripping bark from a willow sapling 200 yards away. It was a long shot for iron sights and old eyes. Amos braced the rifle against a cartonwood trunk. He didn't think about the animal, he thought about the math. Bullet drop. Windage. The shivering of his own muscles. He breathed out, emptying his lungs to steady the barrel. He squeezed the trigger. The crack of the rifle slapped against the canyon walls, echoing back and forth. The doe dropped instantly. Amos didn't cheer. He didn't smile. He pulled his knife and walked toward the carcass. This was weeks of life lying in the snow. As he began to dress the animal, working quickly before the scent drew wolves, the first flake of snow landed on his hand. It didn't melt. He looked up. The sky had opened. The blizzard the rider had promised was here, and he was a mile from his cave with 100 pounds of meat to carry. The real test had begun. The return trip was a lesson in physics and friction. Amos had quartered the doe with numb, clumsy fingers, wrapping the prime cuts in the hide and lashing the bundle with rawhide thongs. He left the ribs and the head for the coyotes, he couldn't afford the weight. The load was 80 pounds of dead weight, dragging behind him on the snow like a corpse. The wind had shifted, coming now from the northeast, a direct assault that felt like sandblasting. The snow wasn't falling down, it was driving sideways, stinging his eyes and matting his beard into a sheet of ice. Every step up the scree slope was a negotiation with gravity. The loose shale, now slick with ice, shifted under his boots. Twice he fell, his knees slamming into the frozen rock, the breath driven out of him. He didn't swear. He didn't pray. He simply waited for the pain to subside into a dull throb, reset his footing, and pulled the rope again. The visibility dropped to 20 feet, then 10. The world had dissolved into a white, howling void. If he missed the cave mouth by 50 yards to the left or right, he would wander onto the exposed ridge and die of exposure within the hour. He navigated by the shape of the ground, feeling the steepness increase, searching for the specific jagged outcrop he used as a landmark. When the dark smear of the cave entrance finally materialized through the whiteoat, Amos was past the point of shivering. His core temperature was dropping, his thinking was becoming slow and syrup-thick. He dragged the meat bundle over the threshold and collapsed inside the doorframe. The difference was immediate. The wind didn't stop, but the biting edge of it was severed by the stone wall he had built. He lay on the dirt floor for 10 minutes, just breathing, listening to the gale tear at the mountain outside. He forced himself up. Survival didn't allow for rest, not yet. He had to secure the door. The willow and hay plug he had constructed was battered but intact. He jammed it into the frame and wedged a heavy log against it to hold it against the wind pressure. Then, he turned to the fire. The coals were faint, buried under ash. He fed them kindling, dry sage twigs he had stockpiled in the back corner. The flame caught, small and orange, a single point of life in the grey dimness. He stripped off his frozen outer coat, shaking the ice crystals onto the dirt before they could melt and soak the wool. He checked his fingers. They were clumsy and pale, but the sensation was returning, a painful, burning prickly heat that meant the nerves were still firing. He had made it. He had fuel. He had shelter. And now, he had meat. For the next 72 hours, the world outside ceased to exist. The blizzard buried the limestone ridges, drifting snow 10 feet deep against the windward faces. Inside the cave, life was reduced to a primal rhythm of maintenance and processing. The space was small, perhaps 12 by 10 feet of usable floor, but the thermal engineering was proving itself. The stone wall, now heated by the continuous fire, radiated a steady, dry warmth. It wasn't hot, Amos could still see his breath near the floor, but it was stable. The smoke drew perfectly up the rock fissure, taking the moisture with it. Amos couldn't just let the meat sit in the slightly warmer air of the cave, it would spoil if he didn't cure it. He transformed the shelter into a smokehouse. He cut the venison into thin strips, hanging them on a rack of green willow branches he lashed together near the ceiling, where the smoke was thickest. The cave filled with the smell of roasting meat and wood smoke, a scent that triggered a deep, animal satisfaction in his brain. He melted snow in his cast iron skillet for water, carefully rationing his movements to conserve energy. He slept in 2-hour shifts, waking instinctively to feed the fire. He was not lonely. The isolation was absolute, but the constant demands of the environment occupied his mind completely. He watched the mice that scurried along the back wall, bold now that he was a permanent fixture. He tossed them a scrap of gristle. They were survivors, too. He spent hours refining his tools. He used a sandstone rock to sharpen his knife until it could shave the hair off his arm. He repaired a tear in his trousers with a bone needle and sinew from the deer. Every object in the cave had a purpose, there was no clutter, no decoration, only function. The storm raged outside, a constant, dull roar that vibrated through the stone floor, but inside, the fire popped and crackled. Amos realized, with a start, that he was more comfortable here, in a hole in the rock, than he had been in the drafty, tension-filled farmhouse. There, he was a burden, a mouth to feed, an old man in the way of progress. Here, he was the master of his domain. He looked at the rows of drying meat, the stack of firewood, the solid stone wall. He had created order out of chaos. He ate the deer heart boiled in water with a pinch of salt, the most revitalizing meal he had eaten in years. The wind died on the 4th morning. The silence that followed was louder than the storm. Amos waited until the sun was high enough to hit the door before he pushed the willow plug aside. It wouldn't move. The snow had drifted against the outside. He had to shoulder it, heaving with his legs, until the snow cracked and collapsed outward. The light that flooded in was blinding. The valley below was a pristine, terrifying expanse of white. Trees were buried to their midsections. The landscape had been reset. Amos spent the morning digging a trench from his door to the edge of the slope, clearing the ventilation and creating a path to his woodpile. He scanned the valley floor with narrowed eyes. The farmhouse was a distant speck, barely visible against the snow. There was no smoke rising from its chimney. Amos watched for an hour, leaning on his shovel. No smoke meant no fire. No fire in this cold meant death. He felt a strange detachment. He had been cast out to die, yet he was the one standing in the sun, warm and fed. He debated staying on the mountain. He owed them nothing. But the logic of the frontier was communal, you didn't let neighbors freeze, even if those neighbors were family who had turned you out. He strapped his snowshoes on, clumsy teardrops he had bent from ashwood and strung with rawhide weeks ago. He began the descent. It was easier going down, but the drifts were treacherous, hiding hollows that could snap a leg. It took him 3 hours to reach the valley floor. The silence at the farmhouse was heavy. The drift had piled up against the north wall, covering the windows. The path to the woodshed was buried, they hadn't kept it clear. Amos walked to the front door and pounded on it with the handle of his hatchet. No answer. He tried the latch. Frozen. He kicked the door near the jamb, shattering the ice seal, and shoved it open. The air inside was freezing, colder than the cave because it was damp. Thomas sat wrapped in 3 quilts at the kitchen table, staring at an empty stove. His wife, Martha, was huddled on the bed with the children. They looked up, eyes hollow, skin grey with the specific lethargy of hypothermia. They had run out of wood 2 days ago and hadn't been able to force the door open against the drift. "Pa!" Thomas croaked, his voice barely a whisper. He looked at Amos, standing there in his buffalo coat, smelling of smoked meat and vitality, a rifle over his shoulder, as if he were seeing a ghost. "Get up," Amos said. He didn't offer a hug. He didn't offer pity. He walked to the stove, opened the firebox, and saw the cold ash. "You let the draft close." Damp killed the fire. Amos took charge with a ruthless efficiency. He didn't ask for permission. He went back outside, found the buried woodshed, and spent an hour digging it out. He hauled armloads of seasoned oak into the house, rebuilding the fire with the specific, patient technique he had perfected in the cave. He boiled snow, made a broth with the dried venison jerky he had brought in his pockets, and forced them to drink it. The warmth slowly returned to the room, and with it, the color to their faces. Thomas watched him, ashamed and confused. The dynamic had inverted completely. The old man, that liability, was the only reason they were breathing. Amos checked the larder. It was nearly empty. They had miscalculated the flour. They had eaten the seed corn. They were starving in a house made of planed lumber while he feasted in a hole in the ground. "The drifts are too deep for the horses," Thomas said later, his hand shaking around a mug of broth. "We can't get to town. We're stuck here." "You're stuck," Amos corrected him. "I'm not." He stood up, adjusting his pack. "Where are you going?" Martha asked, panic rising in her voice. "You can't leave. Stay here. It's warm now." "It's warm because I hauled the wood," Amos said. "I've got a smokehouse full of meat up on the ridge. I've got a wall that holds heat better than these clapboards. I'll bring you meat tomorrow. But I'm sleeping home." He walked out the door, leaving them stunned in the growing warmth of the kitchen. He didn't look back. The winter of 1875 was the harshest on record for the territory, but for Amos, it was a season of triumph. He became a lifeline for the valley. He didn't just survive, he operated. He established a trail between the cave and the farm, packing the snow down until it was a hard highway. He brought venison. He brought knowledge. He showed Thomas how to bank the house with snow to insulate the crawl space, a trick the younger man had dismissed as Indian nonsense a year prior. He showed them how to render bone grease for candles when the kerosene ran dry. The cave itself became a point of curiosity, then envy. One afternoon, a neighbor from 3 miles down, a man named Jensen who had lost 2 toes to frostbite, made the trek up with Thomas. They stood inside the shelter, stripping off their heavy coats as the radiant heat from the stone wall washed over them. 70 degrees, Jensen muttered, looking at the thermometer he had brought. "It's 70 degrees in here, Amos. And you're burning half the wood I am." "Rock holds better than wood," Amos said, stirring a pot of stew on the hearth. "You build against the land, you fight it. You build into it, it helps you." Jensen ran a hand over the clay-plastered chimney. "I need to build a root cellar like this. Come spring. If we make it." "You'll make it," Amos said. "I got another deer yesterday." Spring arrived not with flowers, but with mud. The snow melted into torrential runoff, turning the valley into a swamp. The farmhouse flooded, the cellar filling with 2 feet of brown water. But Amos's cave, high on the scree slope, remained dry. He sat on the stone ledge outside his door, watching the green return to the cottonwoods below. He had survived the test. He had proven the arithmetic. Thomas came up the hill one mild afternoon in May, leading the mare. He looked healthier now, though the winter had aged him. "We're fixing the barn roof," Thomas said, standing awkwardly by the fire pit. "Could use a hand. And there's a room for you in the house. Martha fixed it up nice. We want you back, Pa." Amos looked at the house down in the valley. It was a good house, by civilized standards. But it was fragile. It required constant input from the outside world: nails, glass, milled lumber. His cave required nothing but gravity and stone. "I'll help with the roof," Amos said, standing up and brushing the dust from his trousers. "But I'm staying here." Thomas looked at the stone wall, the curing meat, the perfect efficiency of the camp. He nodded, finally understanding. "It's a good spot," he admitted. "It's my spot," Amos said. Years later, long after Amos had passed, found peacefully in his sleep by the fire, the cave still warm, the structure remained. The farm below changed hands, burned down, and was rebuilt. The town expanded and roads were cut. But hikers and hunters who climbed the limestone ridge would stumble upon a strange anomaly: a perfectly preserved stone wall sealing a cave mouth, a chimney that still drew air, and a sense of ordered calm that defied the wildness of the mountain. They would step inside to escape a sudden rainstorm and marvel at how the heat lingered, how the wind died instantly, and how, for a moment, they felt completely safe. They didn't know the name of the man who built it, or the desperate winter that birthed it. They only knew that someone had been here, someone who understood that to survive the storm, you didn't shout at the wind, you became the rock. The wall stood, a monument to practical competence, enduring long after the sentimental reasons for its construction had faded into the dust.